All right, next up, number 6 in the service worker series. This time we're going to be talking about controlling fetch calls and the cache at the same time in the service worker. So this is kind of what we've been building towards. This is the big thing that you need to be able to do with a service worker. The service worker will act like a proxy server, and that means every request that your browser makes, so this web page, it's asking for the HTML file. Then it's asking for a CSS file. There's a couple of images. There's a Google Fonts CSS file, and then there's a couple of font files that are being requested as well. The JavaScript file from this page is also being requested. So all of these different files are the browser sending a request off, and the service worker is intercepting every one of those requests, and then it gets to decide what happens with them. So that's what we're going to do here. I've started off with the basic service worker, similar to what we had in the previous couple of videos. I'm using 2 caches right now, one for my CSS, JavaScript, HTML assets, one for images, and I only have one image in here. It's just 4 copies of the same image, but it's really just the one image that's in there. Then, in my install event, I'm reading both these arrays and I'm creating 2 caches. One is my static cache, one is my image cache. So those are both being created. And then in the activate, I'm deleting ones that don't match. So right now in here, we can see I've got static cache 1 and image cache 1 down in my cache storage. If I come into my service worker and I update my version, say, okay, I'm going to go version 2, we save that. I come back in here. The new service workers installed. We can see that caches 2 were both created. And if I were to skip waiting and activate this, that's going to delete cache number 1. Okay, so that's where we are right now. Now let's move on to the fetch handler. That's what we want to get to. Right now, what I'm doing in my fetch add event listener is just writing out a message. Every time the browser asks for a file, I'm just writing out the fact that the browser has sent a fetch request. So if I look in the console, sure enough, here's all the files. So I can refresh this, and every time I refresh it, I'm going to get the fetch requests again. So this happens every single time. By default, what happens is if I don't do anything, the service worker just lets the request go through, it goes off to the server, and then goes back to the browser. Fair enough. What we want to do is we want to control this process. So, the respondWith method. This is how we tell this event listener, this extendable event, what we want to do. We're going to say, okay, somebody sent a fetch to us, the fetch event came to us, we want to send something back. So I am going to do pretty much what was already happening. I'm going to call fetch, and I'm going to pass in my event has a request property. So this event that's coming in here, the fetch event, has a property called request, which is the actual request object. You can see right here, I was getting the URL property, and that's how I was writing out all of these URLs. So if I do a fetch for that, that's how I'm responding. I save it. Okay, so that's done. I skip waiting. So we've now activated that. And if I refresh, I still see those same messages. Things are coming back to the browser, same way. If we look in the network tab, what we'll see in here now is that there was an index file right here. One was requested by the browser, and then service worker JS. This is my script. This is the one that did a fetch to get that file. And then a CSS file was requested by the browser. So from index.html, we had another CSS file, an image, a JavaScript file, all these things coming from the browser. Then, after that, my service worker, it went and requested all of these files, the ones that were being requested by the web page. And then we've got the font files, and then those were returned as fetches as well. So all these things Browser sends it to the service worker's then sending it off to bring it back. And we can see that that's happening in the network tab. Okay, fine, so we're doing that. Doesn't really give us any value to this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to work with this. We're going to say, instead of just responding with a fetch call, I'm going to look in my cache first. I'm going to avoid going onto the network, having to go and find that file and bring it back. So inside of here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to open that up. I'm going to respond with, I have to respond with a promise. This thing is expecting a promise, basically a promise that resolves to a response object. I'm going to open up my caches, and I'm going to look. Notice I'm saying cache is not cache. I'm going to call the match method, and I'm going to search through my entire list of caches, however many I have, all of them. I'm going to look for this request. When I find it, what I'm going to get back from the match method is a response object. So this is my cache response. Now this should be a response object, or it will be a response object if it existed inside my cache. If this thing was one of the keys in my cache, if I come over here and we look in the static cache, if one of these things exist, then we're going to get that response object, which will be the actual file. The image one, if one of these is requested, I will get that actual object coming back to me. That's what this cache res is. That's going to be the file coming out of the cache. Now I need to send that back to the browser, but if it's not in my cache res variable is going to be equal to undefined. Now, in a perfect world, this is all I would have to do. We go, we find this thing out of the cache, we get it. If it's undefined, I'm going to write this out. But assuming that none of them are undefined, all I have to do is say return this result. That's going to go back to the browser and we're all good. But we know that not everything was in the cache. There are definitely files that weren't in that cache. So we put an OR here and we do what we did the first time. We just make a fetch call for this. So I'm going to return either this thing, or if this is undefined, meaning it wasn't in the cache, I'll do the fetch. So now I'm only making half the network calls that I was before. So I've saved that. Come back to our service worker. We'll skip waiting. And we can come up here and refresh this. Okay, so fetch requests for that. The font one wasn't in the cache. This second image, this one right here, wasn't in the cache. And the two font files weren't in the cache. Everything else was in the cache. So if we look in the network tab, you should see the same sort of thing. It's those initial requests coming from the browser. And then the service worker did a fetch, but it only did a fetch for these four things: the two font files, the one image, and the one CSS from Google Fonts. Just those four files, the ones that said missing over here. So it's only actually doing a fetch call when it's not in the cache already. So we're saving ourselves having to go onto the network, which means we're creating much better performance in our website. Okay, so that's second step. After that, what we want to do is, well, if I'm doing these fetch calls, I don't want to keep making these fetch calls. I want to actually take what comes back from here and save a copy of that in my cache. I'll send it back to the browser like I'm doing here, but I also want to save a copy in my cache. So let's comment this one out, come down here and do this final one, which is going to be very similar. We're going to start off with the same thing. So all that, I'm not going to bother with the undefined here, that console log message. So we're returning what was in the cache or the result of the fetch. But this is a fetch request, which is a promise. So I can chain then methods onto it, and I can do more things. Let's start with that. So fetch request brings back a response object. So we'll call it fetch response. So check the cache. If it's in the cache, send that back. If not, make a fetch call, but only make it the first time that you're looking for it. Then, after that, we've got the fetch response. Now, I'm going to save it in a cache. Well, I can look at the file and decide, where do I want to save it? Which cache do I want to save it? I have several caches up here. I've got my static one, I've got a dynamic one that I can throw whatever I want in, one for fonts specifically, one for image name, or for images. So let's take a look at the headers that are coming back in here. So we'll take the content type header, find out, hey, is this text/CSS, text/HTML, image/PNG, image/JPEG, font/WFF2, whatever that is, I'm going to use that to determine which cache I want to put it in. So I want to check to make sure type, I did actually get this header. If I got type, then I'm going to do a match, my regular expression match, and I'm going to see if it started with the word text and a / and CSS. There could be a character set or something after that, but if it starts with this, I'm going to say that this thing is CSS, but potentially I don't have that header, but it is a CSS file. So if it doesn't have a header, and the Google font ones don't always have it, so we're going to do another match on this on the URL. So the request that comes in, and I'm going to say, if I've got fonts.googleapis.com, if that is part of the URL, then I'm going to assume that this thing is actually, oops, got an extra one there. So if I have the content type and it is text/CSS, or if I've got this as part of the URL, I'm going to save it inside my dynamic cache. I'll write that message out just so we can see it ourselves. Now we need to return this, and we need to save it in the cache. To save anything in a cache, you have to get a reference to the cache itself. So we're going to call caches.open. Which one do we want? We want the dynamic cache. So that's the one in the variable dynamic name. That's going to give us back a reference to that specific cache. And now, once we have that, we can call cache.put. ep.request, this is the request object. This is what they asked us for. So that's our key. And what are we going to put in here? Well, it's the fetch request, or the response rather. So the fetch response. Now, if I do this, if I just put fetch response here, that's not going to fail. That's going to work. However, on the next line, when I try to say return fetch response, this will fail because I've already used the response object. I've put it into the cache. So I can't put it into the cache and give it back to the browser. I can only do one of the two things. Thankfully, there is a clone method. So I can make a copy of it and put that in the cache and then give the actual response back to the server, or the browser rather. So we're going to do the same thing here with each one of these. So here's our one for the CSS. Then we can do an else if. We'll do another else if. I've got a few that I could do. And at the end, we'll have an else, which is a catch-all. So I have these already, the if statements. I'm just going to copy the if statements over. So the second one, the font files. If we have the font files, we're going to save them into our font cache. So I'm doing the same thing I did here. I'm just putting it into the font cache, same clone, same response. So these two lines right here are identical. I'm just changing what I'm looking for. In the content type, if I see font / something, then it's a font. If I don't have a content type, if it starts with this, if this is part of the URL, well, it's a Google font. So I'm going to save that in my font cache. Then next, images. So I'm going to do the same sort of thing with images. So my value for the content type is image /. If it has image / at the start of whatever the content type is, this is one of my images. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to save it into my image cache, and then fetch response clone, make the copy of it go into the image cache, and then we will do the response. And if it didn't match any of these, if it's just anything else, then we're just going to put it into the dynamic cache. So inside my else, there we go. So I've got other, means it's going into the dynamic cache. Image goes into the image cache. Font goes into the font cache. And CSS will go into the dynamic cache as well. Now, you can arrange your caches, call them whatever you want, organize the files. If you want to just have one static, which is your initial load, and then have a second one where you put everything, go ahead. You can do that. No one's stopping you. Okay, so we skip waiting. And I'm going to refresh. Oh, I got an error here with one of my Google fonts. I'm just going to refresh the page. There we go. So network error. I'm going to leave that there for now. I just refreshed and everything went through fine with the network error. The next video that I'm going to be doing actually is dealing with situations like that. What if I get a 404 error? How do I handle that? What do I do? Do I have backup files? So if I'm building a PWA and I want it to run offline first, how do I handle those errors? So that's next video. For now, that's it. We've got now a fully functional fetch event listener. So we're having requests come in. We're looking inside the cache. If we find it, we return that. That's step one. And then, if we don't find it, we do the fetch. But once we've done the fetch once, from that point on, here we go. Static cache has those original files. My image cache now has this second image added to it. Dynamic cache, we've got that CSS file has been added. And in my font cache, there's the two font files that I'm using in my CSS. So now, if I go to my network tab and I refresh my page, here are all of the requests, everything the page needs, and that's fine. That's what we'd expect. But we've got all of these coming from the browser, but there's no actual call being made to fetch them. If we look right here, in this column right here, the size, we can see every one of these was coming from the service worker. These are actually the files coming out of the cache. We didn't make any network calls. Everything is now coming out of our cache. I can refresh this again and again and again, and it's always going to be coming from the cache thanks to the service worker. So our service worker is going into this cache right here, or these caches, to bring the files back to the page. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments. If it's about handling the 404s, that'll be the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.